Chair McGrory, will you please convene the Committee on Audit?
Thank you, Chairman Day. Will the Committee on Audit please come to order? Today we have 6 requests for public comment. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to address the board. As your name is called, please come to the microphone. And the first 3 speakers are Aaron Castaneda, ASI President, Cal State LA, Leland Wessel, Unit 1 Representative, Student Health Services, San Diego State, and Edgman Hakobian. Aaron?
Hello. Again, my name is Aaron Castaneda, Student Body President at California State University, Los Angeles. I'm here today to speak about the recent audit report, which will be discussed in this committee later on in a bit. It was kind of concerning when I heard the report. I wish I could say it was somewhat of a surprise. But I feel like it's something that students were concerned about as the years have been coming on. Students have been coming to the board of trustees for years and expressing their concerns about the use of money and whether it was being very transparent. I believe a lot of people today have already spoken a lot about transparency and that being an issue. And I hope that the board of trustees are more transparent in the years in the items to come. Regarding the audit itself, in terms of the notification of CSSA being known, in the report states that the Cal State Student Association was aware of all of the $1.5 billion of funds. That is not true. It is true that that the Chancellor's Office did disclose that there would be possible tuition increases that's required by law. However, in those meetings, and I was there 2 out of those 3 years, there was never a discussion about the surplus, or as the Chancellor's Office wants to call it, a reserve of $1.5 billion. And I believe with that information at the time, it would have helped us as well as the community decide whether tuition increase would be appropriate at the time. Ultimately, tuition increases has only happened once in my last 3 years here in student government, but every year has been the same proposal that has been submitted to not just the Cal State Student Association, but to the Board of Trustees about the option is either to raise tuition or to cut programs, which just was not the best way of presenting it now that we are aware that there was this reserve. $1.5 billion is not nothing. It is a lot of funds, and for some it would fund an entire campus for one academic term. And so the board of trustees needs to be more transparent with that. In terms of parking, Cal State LA was not one of the 4 campuses that were audited regarding parking. However, we're currently going through a construction of a parking structure which should be open in a couple of months. And I just want to make sure that Cal State LA follow all the procedures. I've requested for all of those studies of transportation as well. So those are just my thoughts and opinion. I urge that. I understand the Chancellor's Office has produced a memo or a public statement saying that there was some misleading information, but I want the Chancellor's Office to please go beyond that. I understand it was just because of optics, you needed to put that out, but I hope that the Chancellor's Office and this board fully look into the audit report to make sure that everything that was discussed is clarified. Because I saw the Chancellor's report response, but I also saw the response to the audit to the chancellors from the auditors. So that's all I have to say in the matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Leland Wessel.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. My name is Dr. Lee Wessel, and I'm a physician at Student Health Services at San Diego State. I've been there for over 25 years. And during my tenure, I have seen a number of administrations come and go. But there's been one thing that has been constant in my experience at SDSU while we're trying to serve the students, and that is whenever we're trying to recruit staff, the approach from the university, and I suspect speaking with colleagues in my unit and in other units around the state, is similar, that while a range of pay is there for employees and staff, many times actually brackets what is market rate, pardon my granularity, but this is just kind of where we all live, that the practice is to try to keep people bring them in at the lowest level and keep them there indefinitely. I have colleagues at other campuses that have been at the exact same level in their range for 20 years. So where am I going with this? When we see something like $1.5 billion surplus, by the CSU system, held by the CSU system. And you guys, you're at the 30,000 foot level. You've got lots of reasons that we don't understand. I get that. But for those of us who have our boots on the ground, it's really demoralizing to hear that, to read the report, the auditor's report, because it is, public domain. And then to think about all the decades where we've fought and slugged to try to get positions filled. If we can actually recruit somebody, they don't stay because we can't keep them. They're not what the university is willing to pay is not market. And in San Diego, it's only getting worse. It's not as bad as the Bay Area, but we're getting there. I mean, if anybody thinks San Diego is still cheap, well, I'm not sure what year you're thinking of, but right now, a 2-bedroom apartment in the city is $2,500. Well, you can't pay a medical assistant $2,500 a month and expect them to take the job. It just doesn't work that way. So I'm speaking not just for Unit 1, but for all of us who are in staff positions trying to serve our students and trying to give them what they've paid for in terms of tuition and also what they've paid for in student fees. But we're stymied because the universities for which we work won't pay market rate. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the topic, but that really came forward for me when I saw the auditor's report. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lou. Edwin Jacobian?
Hello, my name is Edwin Jacobian, and I'm here to state my personal opinion and criticize the board. Chancellor White, in my opinion, you are not capable of being truthful to the public, and every year you put on unnecessary stress on the students and faculty, and you rattle everyone up by announcing that you're going to be increasing the tuitions, and you've kind of give pamphlets to the student leaders, and I was part of that too. And you give those propaganda documents and ask them to go and kind of force the legislature into giving more funds to the CSU, make an appealing emotional argument. Obviously, we need more funding for the education, but I feel like all this time you've been hoarding money, and it's appalling the way you operate and your audit department the way it operates. It's not just the funding. At Cal State LA, they break the rules and the laws all the time, and you don't care and you cover things up, and you just sit there emotionless. And today or tomorrow, you're going to be making some arguments that doesn't make sense to anyone, and it's so far from reality. If these are operating reserves or whatever you want to call it, why are you not using them to fund the students at Cal State LA, right? These are reserves for operations. Why don't you help them out? Why are you saving them? What's the reason for hoarding all this cash and adding all this stress on the students? In addition to that, this is the second time the state auditor is blank pointing you out for mismanagement and not properly disclosing funds. And I've been coming here for the past year telling the same thing, right? And you guys act as if I'm crazy. Well, I feel like the state auditor kind of points out the same stuff that I'm trying to tell you, and you're ignoring what's going on at a campus level. Your style of leadership or lack thereof, the way you operate and the way your audit department operates, it's appalling, and you're destroying the CSU institution. And I feel like the only way we can get to the bottom of this is for a courageous prosecutor or a journalist to start looking into your actions, or the state oversight committee. I'm going to be going there, and I'm going to take everything I can. I'm going to be informing anyone and all the agencies in regards to the way you operate. And I hope you will be removed, and we get a chancellor that understands the community and serves the community and is capable of being truthful and just. Thank you, and I'll continue tomorrow.
Thank you. The next three speakers are Terry Reese, Chair Bargaining Unit Number 2, Cal CSU EU, and Rocky Sanchez, VP for Representation, CSU EU, and Neil Jacklin, President, CSU EU.
Hi, Tessie Reese, Unit 2 Chair, San Diego State. I want to echo what Dr. Wessel said because we work at the same campus. We are a revolving door, and it was very disheartening to go over the audit and to see what the surplus was and to be on the backs of the students and staff over the last several years. And when we have a campus, in particular my campus, who has a very large surplus from the audit that states, and we're a revolving door, and we cannot bring people and keep people in because we're bringing them at the minimum salary range. Dr. Wessel named a medical assistant. When they're bringing medical assistants and clinical assistants in at $2,600 a month, and that's because they had to, because that's what we bargained this last contract. It was less than that prior to that. We can't keep them because it doesn't pay the bills. If there's a salary range and the minimum is $2,600, doesn't mean you need to bring them in at $2,600. You have a range that goes this way, but no one ever looks at it. So it's, again, very disheartening when I see a large surplus of money that could have been used for various things, not just for staff, we're not that greedy, but for all areas, students, everything. It's very, very disheartening to read that audit and to realize that I personally, over the last 21 years, have seen people come and go over and over and over again. Every year we are hiring and then within a year losing them because we cannot pay them, or let's say the campus will not pay them. We need to do better than that. And transparency obviously was not an issue for this system here, and I don't want to blame anybody because I'm not into that, but this system alone has used this money, has a surplus of $1.5 billion, and it's been on the backs of students, staff. And so let's be transparent moving forward, and let's fix this ship now, because you know what? People are jumping off of it left and right. Thank you.
Thank you. Rocky?
Good afternoon. Rocky Sanchez, VP for Representation from CSUEU. I hail from Cal Poly Pomona. Board of Trustees, Chancellor White, campus presidents, and guests. I'm here speaking regarding the audit, the second audit that I'm aware of in terms of the money that seems to either be paid out to management, executives, or this surplus, $1.5 billion. I do want to say that part of this money came from when we were all furloughed. That was under a different chancellor, Chancellor Reed, not Chancellor White. However, transparency has never been, and I do love the song and dance routine, Chancellor White, that you gave out in your letter in terms of the money, where it's been hidden, and now it's been discovered. For at least a year, I have been hearing, I'm pretty sure it's probably about 2 years, hearing from one of the trustees saying, well, at the UC system, this is what we do. At the UC system, we do that. Slowly but surely, we're turning into a mini UC. But the UC system is not transparent, just like this system, or we're just like them, in terms of either keeping money hidden from the legislature and from the employees. I want to see real transparency. The money that we as faculty and staff had to deal with, or lack thereof when we were furloughed, granted it was under a different chancellor, where is it? We have been hurting. We have tried to bargain to get money so that our people will stay, so our work will not be contracted out, and yet it still goes away. And money is still hidden. A $1.5 billion, not million, but $1 billion surplus that was made on the backs of students with the parking, faculty and staff parking, and being furloughed. Shameful.
Neil?
Good afternoon, Board of Trustees, Chancellor White, campus presidents, and guests. My name is Neil Jacklin, President for CSUEU. In 2006, state law changed and allowed CSU to manage tuition revenue in its own accounts outside of the state treasury. The Legislative Analyst's Office stated that The change could reduce accountability, and it recommended ensuring that CSU routinely report and clearly display tuition in budget documents. Although the Chancellor's Office provided the Joint Legislative Budget Committee and other legislative entities with projections of tuition revenue, it did not include information detailing CSU's accumulated surplus derived primarily from tuition. The CSU Employees Union requested state audit to be authorized by Assembly Member Sharon Kirk Silva to ensure CSU is transparent in its use of tuition and to increase transparency to the public's interest. CSU asked for the audit after discovering that CSU had a surplus of millions of dollars in accounts outside the state treasury, which we shared with the board last year. CSU also wanted to ensure that CSU parking programs were being responsibly operated and that the level and use of student parking permit fees were appropriate. We agree with the state auditor's conclusion and encourage the CSU to implement the reports recommendations as soon as possible. Finally, we wanted to inform you that the legislator has scheduled a special oversight hearing committee on August 12th to review the audit's finding. The hearing should be televised on the California Channel website, and I encourage you all to watch. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. That concludes public comment. It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Is there any objection to the approval of the consent agenda? There are two items on the agenda, the minutes and the audit assignments. Having none, the consent agenda is approved. We'll now move on to the adoption items, or the action items. There are two items on today's agenda. Item 3 of the discussion agenda is an information item, quality assessment review of the California State University System Internal Audit Program. The item will be presented by Larry Mandel, Vice Chancellor and Chief Audit Officer, as well as Kimberly Turner, Chief Audit Executive, Texas Tech University System.
Thank you, Chair McGlory. All California state agencies with an audit function are required to follow the practices put forth by the Institute of Internal Auditors, an international organization based in Florida. The Institute of Internal Auditors' international standards for the professional practice of internal auditing requires that internal audit functions obtain quality assessment reviews every 5 years to assess conformance with IIA standards and the IIA Code of Ethics and to appraise the quality of operations. A quality assessment review team comprised of 3 higher education audit executives visited the Chancellor's office in early January 2019. Kimberly F. Turner, Chief Audit Executive at the Texas Tech University System, led the review and was joined by Richard Cordova, Executive Director of Internal Audit at the University of Washington, and Matthew Hicks, System-wide Deputy Audit Officer at the University of California. Kim Turner joins us today to present the report on the results of the Quality Assessment Review. Kim will speak to the following areas: the scope and methodology used for the review, the overall opinion as to conformance with standards, and observations and recommendations for continued program enhancement. Once Kim has made her presentation, we will then answer any questions you may have. Kim?
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for having me come present the results of this review. The scope of our review covered the Division of Audit and Advisory Services for a period of 5 years ending in January 2019. Our methodology was consistent with that of peer reviews that are conducted all over the country. It started with interviews of selected stakeholders, both within the Chancellor's office and with presidents and others on the campuses. We also did interviews and surveys of audit staff members. We reviewed documents prepared by audit, including a sample of audit reports issued for the past couple of years. And we also reviewed audit's quality assurance and improvement program for its own operations. These activities were all performed during or around the time of our on-site visit, which occurred during January of this year. Our overall opinion is that the CSU internal audit function generally conforms with the IIA standards and the Code of Ethics, which is the highest of 3 possible ratings. The lower ratings would have been partially conforms or does not conform. This opinion of generally conforms means that the policies, procedures, and practices are in place to implement the standards and the requirements necessary for ensuring independence, objectivity, and proficiency in the internal audit program. In addition, audit is held in high regard by its key stakeholders within CSU, indicating that the office is accomplishing its mission to assist university management and the Board of Trustees in the effective discharge of their fiduciary and administrative responsibilities. I want to highlight a few strengths in the program that we took note of. First of all, the reporting lines of the Chief Audit Officer, which are functionally to the Audit Committee of the Board and administratively to the Chancellor, represent the strongest possible governance structure an internal audit function can have. The Chief Auditor's rapport with the Audit Committee and with senior leadership is strong, with open lines of communication among the parties. The Division of Audit has a good reputation across CSU for its work and for the positive tone and collegial approach of its staff. Next, another noteworthy strength, Audit has contracted with the California Military Department Cyber Network Defense Team to run scans of CSU's information technology systems. This is an innovative and cost-effective approach to improve the security posture of CSU and help manage the information technology risks and threats that are continually increasing for all of us. And finally, the redesign of the audit function's work in response to the previous peer review team recommendations has been well received by the campuses. In addition to providing a solid body of assurance work, the advisory services function is especially highly valued by the senior leadership team in the Chancellor's office, as well as by the presidents on the campuses. In my experience, the most effective sometimes and helpful aspects of a peer review are those observations from experienced auditors that go beyond the mere question of conformance with the standards and the code of conduct. These are things that we've seen in action in our own audit shops or others that can further elevate a high-performing audit shop. This category includes only suggestions. They're not equivalent to audit recommendations. They're not required to be implemented. Rather, they are, and they don't imply the existence of concerns or issues. Rather, we see them as opportunities for consideration that may enhance the program even further. Here are those ideas that we had. First of all, many universities and systems operate with a code of ethics in place. And while we didn't see signs of a questionable ethical environment, we did suggest consideration of a code, really believing it would complement and support existing policies and procedures. The next consideration was for a whistleblower hotline. A number of institutions, including Texas Tech, implemented a hotline following the passage of the 2002 Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, which was aimed at strengthening the environment in public companies after the corporate failures of Enron and WorldCom. Adopting measures reflecting the spirit of Sarbanes-Oxley was common in higher education at that time. Whistleblower hotlines provide a mechanism for complaints, anonymous or otherwise, to be made through one central communication channel, which helps with consistency and handling of reports. A third-party hotline could also help provide complainants with greater assurance that their identity, whether or not that's disclosed to the hotline, will be protected. Next, we suggested consideration of an institutional compliance function. Complex organizations have an enhanced risk profile, including those risks around compliance matters. CSU's decentralized model compliance is fairly common in higher education. In fact, of our 4 universities in my system, 2 of them have this same model. However, some organizations have improved their management of compliance risks through identifying an institutional compliance officer to support communication, coordination, training, and risk monitoring across the campuses. We're not advocating for centralized handling of compliance matters. Rather, we just see this as a mechanism to further support the existing compliance functions across the system and the campuses. And finally, we had suggestions related to consistent prosecution in cases of wrongdoing, and I understand that this that a change is already in process related to that. Finally, we made a few suggestions related to the internal operations of the audit office. These are likely at a more detailed level than we may want to cover here. Again, not implying weakness, just further enhancements for Mr. Mandel's consideration. In conclusion, the team enjoyed our time we spent here, and our work confirmed that Mr. Mandel leads a strong and vibrant audit function that provides a real benefit to CSU. As happens in most of the peer reviews I've ever conducted, I felt that I took back as many positive ideas as I brought to the team. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Kimberly. And I think in conclusion, there are 3 potential ratings that we could have received, and we received one that's called generally conforms, which in accountant talk is the top rating.
Yes, that's the top rating.
Okay, great. Are there any questions? Wanda?
So the recommendations that were made, the enhancements, what is the status of those suggestions?
The status currently is that we bring them forward to management and we discuss them and talk about them, and they decide which ones they may want to go forward with, which ones may not be in the best interest of the university.
In general, they all seem pretty reasonable, so we ought to have a report that would come back to the board then, and maybe 2
We could
meetings
come
from now.
back.
Chancellor White?
Yeah, this report was just made available to management, even though it's dated January 19th. And so we will be taking them into consideration, working with you as chair of audit, and decide, the cost benefits, if you will. I think, the idea of, for example, the whistleblower hotline, is not without a resource investment. And, what would be the ROI of experiences that you've had in Texas and University of California and other places that have a system-wide hotline versus a local hotline? Anytime you have a hotline, then you also have a staff to follow up on everything that comes in, and likewise with the compliance and ethics. We have, so much of our ethics and compliance work is decentralized and focused, for example, around Clery or around a campus-related issue. And with a heterogeneous system, sometimes you wonder, do you need a system policy that has any granularity to it, or is it granularity at the campus level? And so I think that's the analysis that we will now undertake with this very thoughtful report and come back to you before making any changes or recommendations for change.
Okay, great. But at some point, we'll see recommendations and what the disposition of those for the board. Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's important to recognize that these are professional suggestions, are not recommendations, and so they come at a different level of choice for us, and we will be complicit with that.
Okay, thank you. Adam?
And so to Trustee Fong's question, just so I'm clear, since audits is such a specialty function, I think, as I heard Mr. Mandel respond, perhaps some of these may be management, but really most of this is directed to the audit division, and implementation really rests with the chief audit officer as to how he organizes his division. Is that correct? Working through the audit chair?
Yeah.
Not through, because audit is completely independent of Tim.
Right.
From a policy perspective and
Yeah,
management.
the auditor reports to the chair of the audit committee, and we'll take up the issues and the suggestions and the analysis that Larry comes up with. Any other questions? Yes, you go.
Well, I welcome this this report. And so how often are these audits done?
Yes. The Institute of Internal Audit standards require that a peer review be conducted at least every 5 years. If you were in Texas, you would get to undergo this every 3 years like I do, because we also have to follow the Yellow Book standards of the federal government. But at least every 5 years to conform with standards.
Well, anyway, I just want to attest to your finding that, you know, the staff has how would I say, open line of communication, and good relations with the committee leadership. I have been in this committee now for 5 years, and that is the case.
Good.
I wanted to ask you about your suggestion about having somebody focus on compliance. Is this somebody that would be on staff? Would this be somebody that would be an outside independent contractor who would make these, do that kind of study, or what? Or I assume it would be an ongoing. So what is best practices in this?
You know, it's hard to say best practices because different things work well at different places. And so some that I've seen, I mentioned that we have 4 universities in our system. 2 of them have an institutional compliance officer position, which is a staff position. The other 2 do not. Even the two health sciences centers in our system, which have institutional compliance officers, those 2 individuals have slightly different roles at their 2 universities. Overall, it's pretty decentralized. They don't have all compliance responsibility. They have certain things that fall under their umbrella. And because there are compliance requirements everywhere in every aspect of our business, right? Whether it's research, student, privacy, Title IX, athletics, it doesn't matter what it is. There are compliance requirements. Institutional advancement, we have donor money that has strings attached. By necessity, there will always be decentralized compliance activities. One thing that I've seen work, even in a decentralized environment, is where there might be one person that is serving in a coordination and communication role that periodically brings the heads of the various decentralized compliance activities together so they can discuss compliance issues and matters that may cross over. While the details of compliance differ based on the laws, regulations, contracts, policies, whatever you're trying to comply with, the bones of a compliance program are the same. You understand what the requirements are. You understand when there are changes. You put things in place to make sure things are working like they should. You monitor those, and then you have a continuous improvement process that brings that full circle.
Is it reasonable to say that this could be, let's say, you could hire an external law firm or accounting firm to perform this function instead of having a staff person?
You could. I'm not familiar with someone who's done that, but I'm certain it's been done somewhere.
The other question I want to ask about transparency as a trustee. Were you denied any documents or denied access to any individual in the process of you conducting this audit?
That's a great question. No, we received everything that we asked for, whatever reports we wanted. We had access to work papers, including on advisory function work, which was so we felt like the whole office was laid open for us to be able to inspect everything we needed to.
Thank you very much.
Good. And Hugo, I want to thank you, Kimberly, and your team for doing this evaluation. We appreciate it, and we will follow up on your suggestions. Thank you very much. This concludes item number 3. And as my first meeting as chair of the audit committee, I thought I'd add this next item just to spice things up a little bit. Item 4 is an information item regarding the status of the California State Auditor Report 2018-127 regarding financial accounts invested outside the state treasury and campus parking programs. The item will be presented by Larry Mandel, Vice Chancellor and Chief Audit Officer, and Brad Wells, Associate Vice Chancellor, Business and Finance. Before Larry and Brad begin their presentation, Chancellor White will first make a few introductory remarks.
Well, thank you, Trustee McGrory. As will be discussed in detail momentarily, the California State Auditor recently concluded an audit regarding our funds deposited as required by statute in state trust accounts that are held outside of the state treasury. The audit report refers to these as, quote, outside accounts, and they include funds from student tuition, parking and housing fees, gifts, and other sources. The audit also examined campus parking and alternative transportation programs at 4 of our campuses. The audit report made several helpful findings and recommendations regarding these matters. We will review these shortly as well, and as stated on pages 2 and 3 of the Committee on Audit Board Report, Agenda Item 4, We have established work groups to implement all of the recommendations regarding our state trust accounts and our parking and alternative transportation programs. Let me be very clear. We value and take to heart the recommendations of objective audits from our own audit division, from the California State Auditor, and from bona fide outside firms. They are an important strategic tool to make CSU a stronger institution and to provide increased stakeholder confidence. Regrettably, in this case, the sensationalized headline and inaccurate language in the audit report mischaracterized the nature of the CSU's designated reserve funds, describing the reserves as a, quote, discretionary surplus. This mischaracterization implies that the funds are extra monies that could be put to any use, including regular ongoing operations, or that they were unneeded. This is misleading and inaccurate. More troubling, the report suggests that we were not transparent about our financial operations and failed to disclose information about our reserves to legislators, to other state officials, as well as to our students. I cannot state it more plainly or more emphatically. These assertions are factually incorrect. Following the audit report's publication, the mischaracterizations and inaccuracies were amplified in extensive media coverage, inflaming, misleading, and confusing the public in such a way that risked unfairly tarnishing the California State University's reputation to the detriment of its faculty and staff, to the detriment of its more than 4 million students and alumni of this extraordinary institution. And to that, I take great umbrage. And it is why I have and will continue to stand up for this revered university and all of its people, past, present, and future. And it is also why we are having this conversation today, to correct these inaccuracies for all of the California State University stakeholders and to present the facts accurately and comprehensively. Larry, please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Chancellor. This item summarizes the audit by the California State Auditor regarding monies invested by the CSU in state trust accounts. Monies from certain sources, such as student tuition, parking fees, housing fees, and gifts, are required by statute to be deposited in state trust accounts, what the audit calls outside accounts. These monies are deposited by the CSU in commercial bank accounts rather than the state treasury and invested pursuant to statutory requirements. The audit also reviewed campus parking and alternative transportation programs at 4 campuses. The audit was conducted by the state auditor at the direction of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. The Office of the State Auditor began work in September 2018 and conducted site visits at the Office of the Chancellor, CSU Channel Islands, San Diego State, Sacramento State, and CSU Fullerton. Staff assigned by the state auditor requested and received detailed financial transaction information, policy documents, and more than 30 reports related to the audit scope, all covering the 10-year audit period from fiscal year 2008-9 through 2017-18. In a moment, Brad Wells will describe more about the information provided to the auditors. The audit report was issued on June 20, 2019, and included recommendations for both the legislature and the CSU. With regard to parking and alternative transportation programs, the audit report affirmed that CSU revenues were appropriately spent and that CSU earnings were dispersed correctly. However, the number of parking spaces built during the 10-year period did not keep pace with enrollment growth at the 4 campuses, and alternative transportation programs were not always fully explored. Regarding monies invested by the CSU in state trust accounts, the audit report found that CSU policies and practices appropriately safeguarded the accounts, but CSU's reserve policy did not specify recommended minimum levels of reserves. In addition, although the CSU provided many examples of publications and presentations with financial information about reserves, net assets, and investment balances, the audit report's assessment was that 2 other examples did not provide information about $1.5 billion in designated reserves maintained in state trust accounts. The first example in the audit report was the annual tuition proposal sent to the California State Student Association, which described a potential tuition increase. We send the proposal in November to comply with notice requirements of the Working Family Transparency Act. The second example, called the Academic Sustainability Plan, was required by the 2016 Budget Act to use Department of Finance budget assumptions and continue future CSU enrollment trends and other performance measures. Both examples focused on ongoing base budget operating assumptions and were not intended nor required to evaluate the use of one-time designated reserves to fund ongoing operations. As a result, neither of these two reports included an analysis of designated reserves. Going forward, we will incorporate a description of one-time designated reserves and emphasize that use of one-time funds for recurring expenses is not fiscally prudent. Turning now to recommendations made by the state auditor and for the CSU, the audit report recommended that the Office of the Chancellor revitalize campus transportation committees and make procedural changes in how these committees operate, and also ensure that campuses thoroughly investigate and evaluate alternative transportation strategies when considering the construction of new parking facilities. The audit report further recommended that the Office of the Chancellor revise the system-wide policy regarding designated reserves to include minimum levels of reserves and improve the disclosure and transparency of financial information. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Brad now, who will provide additional information about two areas the audit report focused on: financial transparency and designated reserves.
The audit report subtitle suggested that the CSU did not provide information to our stakeholders about account balances. As Larry noted, we provided more than 30 reports to the audit staff during the 9 months they worked on the audit, ranging from detailed financial transaction data to reports published by the Office of the State Controller. I want to highlight just a few of the public reports that include information about reserves, net assets, and investment balances. Each year, the California State Controller publishes the Budgetary Legal Basis Annual Report, which is used by the Department of Finance to help prepare the annual state budget. The report includes account balances reported by the CSU and invested in state trust accounts, including the $1.5 billion in designated reserves reported in the audit. 10 of these reports were provided to the auditor, one for each year of the audit period. We also provided annual investment reports, which are presented to the trustees and sent to the Department of Finance and the legislature. These reports show the total investment balances at fiscal year end and include the cash held in state trust accounts. 10 annual investment reports were also provided to the auditor. Since the late 1990s, CSU has produced audited financial statements as part of a long-standing policy and practice to ensure financial transparency. The CSU is one of few state entities that produce standalone, externally audited financial statements, which include detailed information about cash, restricted and unrestricted net assets, and designated balances, both system-wide and for the campuses. The CSU engages multinational firm KPMG to audit these financial statements that are available on our financial transparency site and sent to the State Controller, the State Treasurer, and the Director of the Department of Finance. Draft financial statements are discussed in detail with the Chair and Vice Chair of the Finance Committee and presented annually to the Board of Trustees for discussion and approval. As with the previous two reports, 10 of these audited financial statements were also provided to the auditor during the audit. Finally, the Chancellor sent 2 detailed letters to the legislature responding to questions and providing information about investments in state trust accounts, including the $1.5 billion referenced in the audit report. In addition to the financial reports presented on the previous slide, our transparency site, which has been in operation for a decade, contains an extensive library of information about CSU financial activity. Furthermore, Mary Eck, Assistant Vice Chancellor of Financial Services and CSU Controller, presented a new financial transparency portal at the last board meeting that will help make financial information even more accessible and meaningful. To provide an early indication of usage of this new portal, about 1,000 people visited during the last 90 days. We intend to enhance this new portal to help respond to some of the specific recommendations made in the new audit report. The audit report's reference to discretionary surplus mischaracterizes the crucial role that designated reserves play in CSU's financial picture and may imply that one-time designated reserves could be used in lieu of ongoing revenue sources, such as state funding or student tuition, to pay for ongoing costs. CSU's reserve policy encourages campuses to build operating reserves to deal with cyclical state recessions, to support year-to-year operations. Bond rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch, periodically assess revenues when evaluating CSU's debt program. Operating reserves also improve the university's debt-to-equity ratio, which is one of the key measures of financial viability, and contribute to CSU's relatively high bond ratings, resulting in lower borrowing costs. Many of you on the board and some in the audience may recall a presentation made to the Committee on Finance in September 2017 that described our reserve policy, categories of reserves, how much the CSU maintains in reserves, and goals for each of the 3 reserve categories. As we mentioned at that September 2017 board presentation, reserves are available for non-recurring expenses and designated for purposes as authorized by the Education Code. There are 3 broad categories of designated reserves shown on the pie chart: short-term obligations, capital outlay, and operations. Within each of these broad categories, campuses establish and maintain reserves in more specific subcategories. Campus reserves by category and subcategory are reported on the Financial Transparency Portal. Reserves designated for short-term obligations include encumbrances, financial aid disbursements, and programs that span the fiscal year in. Short-term obligations comprised about 44% of our designated reserves in the operating fund. Reserves are also designated for non-recurring capital outlay needs in response to the change in state budgeting beginning in 2014-15, which shifted responsibility for capital costs from the state to the CSU. Capital outlay reserves made up about 25% of total designated reserves in the operating fund. Finally, reserves are designated for operations. This category represents about 31% of the total and are designated to deal with periods of fiscal challenge and economic disruption. When we inevitably confront the next recession, campuses will use designated reserves as a one-time supplement to help manage the often rapid decline in state resources, allowing the campus time to adjust operating budgets appropriately to balance reductions and minimize disruptions to our students' education as much as possible. One outcome of the September 2017 discussion was that CSU campuses should strive to increase designated reserves over time to enhance financial resiliency in anticipation of future fiscal challenges. Lastly, the CSU is not alone in establishing and maintaining reserves. Designated reserves are common in higher education, and maintaining reserves is a prudent fiscal practice. In a post just last month, the Public Policy Institute of California highlighted CSU's prudent saving strategy and described our reserves as key to preserving student access when we face the next recession. Interestingly, PPIC used the financial portal to prepare the material for this report. Publications from the National Association of College and University Business Officers, NACUBO, also emphasize the importance of operating reserves and suggest a minimum 3 months of operating costs are appropriate. The CSU presently falls short of this minimum with about 2.5 months in total designated operating reserves. We will continue to build designated reserves as part of our overall efforts to do precisely what the PPIC suggests: preserve access and maintain student outcomes. Larry will now discuss our next steps regarding the audit.
Once the audit was made public, Chancellor White reached out to stakeholders. The Office of the Chancellor will provide required status reports to the state auditor after 60 days, 6 months, and 1 year, or until the recommendations have been fully implemented. We believe that the recommendations made to the CSU will be implemented not later than 1 year from now, with some occurring more quickly. The Joint Legislative Audit Committee has also scheduled a follow-up hearing on August 12th, and Chancellor White and others have agreed to appear at that hearing. This concludes our presentation. Joining us is Cindy Sanford, our Director of Intergovernmental Audits, to help answer any questions you may have about the audit process, while Brad will answer any technical questions you may have.
Thank you, Larry and Brad, for that informative presentation. Just in terms of my own professional experience, having been in the city manager's office in the city of San Diego for 15 years and being the city manager for 7 years, reserves were always a controversial issue. It wasn't a budget season that went by that the employee organizations or a couple of council members didn't want to go in and raid the reserves and fund their favorite programs. Having had this experience, I believe strongly that we need to maintain adequate reserves. They are not discretionary surpluses. They're an essential part of our financial framework. And this is more than a best practice. It's an essential practice. Prudent fiscal management requires adequate reserves to cover emergencies and significant economic downturns. History has shown us throughout this state that those California government agencies that have endured financial crises or even bankruptcy are those that did not have an adequate reserve policy to mitigate against an economic downturn. I see this audit as demonstrating that CSU has a prudent reserve policy in place. I think it needs to be revisited. We need to set a minimum reserve. I agree with what Brad said. We do not have an adequate reserve now. I mean, we're being criticized for having them. It's not adequate. We need to grow those reserves so that we're at least at a 3-month operating reserve with a 6-month maximum. I don't believe that this organization, I don't believe that Chancellor White or his team have been in any way, have been anything less than fully transparent in the process. I haven't been around a public sector manager like Tim, who is incredibly transparent. There is no effort here that I could see in reviewing all of the information, and there was no effort to try to hide the fact that these reserves were designated and available. I do think we need to have the reserve policy revisited, as I said. I think as importantly as all of the controversy around the reserves, I think there were some significant issues that were raised in the parking section of the audit. How parking structures are funded, the fact that at San Diego State, the students funded a faculty parking garage was interesting. I'm not sure that that's something, that's a course that we should be following. I think the fact that the parking fees for the faculty are 1/3 of what the students pay is upside down, and we need to fully revisit that in collective bargaining. And I think we should put the employee organizations on notice that just isn't a fair and equitable policy. And I think there were a lot of good suggestions in the audit. I don't think we should be overly defensive. I think we are critical in the characterization and the language that was used in the audit, but there were some good findings, and we ought to be positive about embracing the recommendations, following through and making changes to make this system a better system. With that, Adam?
Well, thank you. And I'd like to thank Larry and Tim for your presentations. I'd like to thank you, Chair McGrory, for placing this item on the agenda, for placing a spotlight on what I think at best can be characterized as a sloppy and inaccurate report. I think it's disappointing since the state auditor, both personally and professionally, is held in such high regard, and rightfully so. But unfortunately, her office's report in this regard, especially as it relates to our reserves, is simply widely misses the mark, in my opinion. I'm passionate about it because I've spent the many hours working with Tim and his leadership team, as well as other trustees, current and former chair of the audit committee, and it's disappointing to see such a factually inaccurate and wildly misleading report as it relates to CSU's practices and transparency. It's dead wrong on the policy, as you indicated. Our reserves are woefully inadequate to begin. The implication that we should be using one-time reserves for ongoing costs is the quickest way to doom. And it's ironic given the fact that the governor and the state legislature are being applauded, and rightfully so, for boosting the state's rainy day reserves, which is exactly what this board has been doing. Um, it is also, should point out, internally inconsistent, as others have noted, and I've said so to the media. I personally take great umbrage, as the chancellor says, because I know every single year at this dais I have asked questions of the chancellor and the assistant chancellor and the chief audit officer and our outside financial auditor, KPMG. Every single year I point out the page and line item of where those reserves are. And I've been on this board for almost 6 years. So for people to suggest that somehow this is not publicly available is simply inaccurate. I frankly think this board should be, well, dismayed is the most mild word I can come up with, but there's a stronger word for it. But this board should be extremely dismayed for 2 reasons. One, this report characterizes our chancellor in a very negative light, inaccurately, much like the public testimony we've heard today repeatedly, inaccurate statements about our chancellor and his staff. More importantly, it thereby infers that this board is not doing our job, which is completely inaccurate. We are fully transparent. We are completely accountable. Our reserves are too low to begin with. And I think we, as you said, we have nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. Take it as a strategic tool and learn from it where we can, but also where it's inaccurate, we need to call it out for what it is and correct the record.
Thank you, Adam. Romy?
Well, as Trustee McGrory said, it's always controversial when you have reserves. It gives the public impression that that entity, the CSU or whoever that may be, has too much money. But what we are faulted for is saving money. Nowhere, either in the report nor in the media, it has been insinuated that a single dime was misspent or misappropriated. So the worst that we are being criticized for is having saved money.
I think as Larry pointed out, and Brad in the presentation, it's interesting that a week before the audit came out, the Public Policy Institute of California, which is probably the most renowned nonprofit public policy organization in the state, came out with the title of their report was CSU's Prudent Saving Strategy. The California State University system is taking significant steps to improve its financial position and increase transparency with a new public online financial transparency portal. It shows that CSU is building both capital and operating reserves that could help soften the blow in the event of an economic downturn. They viewed it as a very positive thing, what we were doing. Hugo?
Yeah, I as a member of and a trustee of the CSU, I was disheartened to read a couple of the editorials, including one in the Fresno Bee, my local newspaper, because it wasn't an implication. It was stated that we as trustees were not doing our job, and that is not accurate. As Chair Day has articulated, we have, during the presentations and other times, we do ask questions about the finance, including when we had the presentation on the reserves. Several of us, including myself, did ask questions about the appropriateness of the level of these. And so, it's really unfortunate to see this narrative being introduced by independent media, and that's unfortunate.
Any other comments?
And not true.
Thank you, Hugo. Any other comments? Lieutenant Governor?
So I continue to be baffled by the reaction of the CSU to the auditor's report. There's a real disconnect to me. And I think it's really important for the record here to try in sort of layman's terms, as best as I can, to explain what the auditor concluded. And essentially, what they concluded is that over the course of about a 10-year period, this account, whether you call it a surplus or a reserve,
went from $250 million to $1.5 billion while the CSU was raising tuition. And they suggested strongly that people involved in the question of whether tuition should be raised were not made fully aware or as aware as they should have been, including students, that throughout this 10-year period, this surplus/reserve was growing at this rate. Now, you can say, well, all of this money now is a reserve, even though what they're saying is, well, it's a reserve if it's allocated. If it is not specifically allocated, then it's really a surplus that's being generated primarily, according to this report, from income coming from tuition. So if it weren't put into this surplus/reserve fund, the funds could be used for ongoing operations the way that tuition monies are regularly used for operation. So it's a choice. It's a choice that the income from the tuition is not going toward operations. Instead, it is going to build this fund. I don't think it's an unfair analysis at all for the auditor to have pointed this out and to make two general categories of recommendations, one of which is to better present this information under the category of transparency, which my understanding it's also required by law when it's in a discussion about tuition increases. And secondly, that as we just heard, the trustees should be having a conversation about how big should a reserve be. And again, according to the recommendation of the auditor, in order to designate these funds as reserve funds, they should actually be designated, which many of them, a big portion of this, is not designated at all. And I'm very pleased to hear that the recommendation of the staff and of the chancellor, the president, is to, chancellor, sorry, if you see I got it confused. I'm very pleased to hear that he is recommending that we accept all of the recommendations in the audit. That is really, to me, a very, very important outcome of this meeting, if that is what happens here today. But I will say, it seems to me there's been quite a bit of emotion about something that really is pretty straightforward, which is that when you're talking about $1.5 billion, of which a large portion of it is not designated for anything specific other than this idea that you should have a target amount of money in case, 2.5 months or 3 months. And that people should know that these unrestricted funds exist and are part of the conversation. It seems to me the auditor's doing their job, and in accepting the recommendations, we'll be doing our job as well.
I would just like to respond. I think to your point about emotion, I certainly have expressed some emotion. I think our chancellor has too. I think it's human nature to express emotion when your character is attacked by a state agency inaccurately. You suggest that it's not unfair for the auditor to ask the question. I would probably agree with you. It's not unfair if the auditor wants to ask the question, although the auditor is not a trustee, and it's the trustee's job to set policy. And this discussion has been had for many years, as I said, at least the 6 years that I've been on this board. And this board overwhelmingly, if not unanimously, has given the chancellor the direction to build these reserves. So it's not been happening in a vacuum. It's actually been happening consciously, intentionally, and strategically with direction from this board. It's the board's policy to build the reserve, and it needs to be built even more. If a future board wants to change that, or if this current board wants to change that based on changed circumstances, this board has the flexibility to do so. But I think what's unfair is the way the auditor's report presented this board and this system's actions and the transparency.
I think what, and I'll just just say something else in terms of clarifying. I think what has happened, and it's happened to me a few times in my career, somehow this report got characterized in a way that it was set up like a softball for the media to just accuse us across the state on the front page of every single newspaper with editorials of playing hide the ball. And I don't think we hid the ball. I think there were some things that have been misunderstood, and somehow the Public Policy Institute looked at our portal and came away with the designation on all these reserves. I mean, it's not that we were hiding or not designating them, but the problem is sometimes looking at an official accounting report as opposed to a budget document, the numbers look different. And the way we're budgeting a reserve, and it has 3 specific allocations in it.
So let me just say, first of all, again, I'm perplexed by this, that you would say a public agency has attacked your character. Where is a character attack in this report? Give me a line that shows a character attack.
I'd be happy to give you line by line, but the facts are inaccurate. The bottom line is the facts are inaccurate.
Well,
They said we were not transparent. That's not true. They said these were surpluses. That's not true. They said we didn't disclose it. That's not true. Facts are hard things sometimes.
Well, I'll tell you, just myself as someone who considers the ability to understand numbers, the reason I'm very happy that we're accepting these recommendations for additional transparency is that it doesn't look like it was very transparent to me. And so there's going to be a hearing coming up, and we can all attend, and the members of the public can attend. The JLAC is going to hear from the auditor, and the auditor will be able to explain these things. But the fact that members of the legislature who've been involved, who I've talked to, didn't know that there was $1.5 billion of discretionary money, and students certainly didn't know that there was $1.5 billion of discretionary money, and members of the workers who work on campus didn't know there was $1.5 billion of discretionary money. So, you know, I don't think this is a character attack, but I do think that we can do a lot better in making clear that there is a large amount of discretionary money. I think as trustees, it's up to us to program this because it has not been adequately programmed enough to be able to call it a reserve over a surplus. And again, I'm just baffled by it. Taking the recommendations is very important. Suggesting that this is a character attack is just beyond me.
I would just conclude, not to have the back and forth, but I would conclude that if anyone says they weren't aware of this, then they haven't been to our board meetings, they haven't read our agendas, they haven't looked at our budgets, they haven't looked at our audited financial statements each and every year, many times throughout each year. It's just simple as that. It's not been hidden.
Billy?
Yeah, so I not to get too emotional about it, but when I heard about the audit, I remember thinking, I know that we've discussed the reserve. I mean, that word, what a reserve is. And I went back and I looked at and everybody can access this online, the meeting in 2017, and I watched the whole thing. We discussed it for 45 minutes, I believe. Emily Hinton, who was our student trustee at the time, was sitting next to Steve Relia. We were asking him lots of questions. I know more than 2 of us said, is this enough? I mean, I don't know how many of you followed Susie Orman, who was sort of my financial guru for many years, who always said, you got to have at least, some people say you should have 5 months or 6 months. I didn't think you need a year in reserve because anything can happen. And I'm not an economist or a CPA, but ran a household for many years, and I know you have to have it. You don't know what it's going to be used for. Your car could break down. You can break a leg. Your house can burn down. You don't know exactly what it's going to go for, but you should have a certain amount in the bank that is untouchable until a disaster happens. And I think at that meeting and from the PPIC report that we don't have enough. And I know that we discussed it at the time and that it's been available. So that's just my recollection as a trustee.
Becky?
The English language, capable of so many interpretations. I came on the board, what was it, almost 8 years ago, and people were still kind of reeling from what had happened to the CSU as a result of the 2008 recession. I mean, the institution was forced to raise tuition, cut faculty, cut jobs. It was a painful. I wasn't here for it, but you could tell from everybody who was here for it that it was extraordinarily painful for everybody involved. And I believe that is about the time when, smart and forward-thinking people, and with the leadership of Governor Brown, who also always felt that there should be a rainy day fund to prepare for the next god-awful financial situation that we might face. That's when we began to build, a backup plan for this institution because of the care that everybody had for the institution. So I think part of what people are feeling is that the adage, no good deed goes unpunished, felt very accurate when it came out that after suffering through what the institution did and trying to protect everybody in this institution from having to deal with that again, we were, and you're right that you could read this as something other than an attack on our, but I'm sure for those of us who read it, it felt like some kind of a heavy criticism, if not an attack. And I think what really exacerbated it is exactly what Jack said, which is that the language was such that the media picked it up and presented it in a way maybe not intended by the auditor, but nonetheless, that was our first sort of understanding of what was going on. Is it was in the LA Times, of this, and I'm sure everybody had the experience I did, where 17 of my friends forwarded the article to me and said, basically, what the hell are you doing? Right. And it was like, we're trying to do the best job we can for this institution. So, this too shall pass. I agree with you that we can all learn something from it. But that maybe gives you some sense of why there is so much, I maybe a little less baffled after hearing some of that.
Jane?
Thank you very much.
I agree with the Lieutenant Governor that the focus here that I think as a board, what we should focus on is the relationship between tuition increases and the rise in these unspent funds for, I'm trying to find a neutral term here. And there's a figure 4 in the state auditor's report that shows how the unused funds increased in relationship to tuition increases and the general fund appropriations. And I think it would be helpful to have a presentation to this board about where these surplus funds came from. I assume they came from slower hiring, unfilled positions, savings in payroll that we had anticipated for, that there are vacancies. And so we have to budget for them. So then and I could be totally wrong, but that's kind of my assumption. So then there's money left, and that ends up going into a reserve fund at the end of the year. And we don't budget at a lower amount, assuming those positions are going to stay open. We budget, again, assuming they're going to be filled. And so I think it would be very helpful to have a report on these relationships here in this figure 4, so that if and when, God forbid, we ever have to consider a tuition increase again, we have a firm understanding of where we are in this whole scenario. Because certainly in my memory, we only ever discussed a tuition increase when we did not get the general fund appropriation, which we believed to be adequate to sustain the programs at this university. That was the only reason we did the tuition increase. Now, if that wasn't totally right, I'd like to get that squared away now so we never do it again. And if it was right, I'd like to have the public know about it. So I hope we can have a staff report on how this all occurred.
Chancellor White?
Yes, I really do appreciate the conversation, and we, as I said in my opening comments, we will be adhering to every recommendation that the state auditor provided. And our first report to the auditor is due at 60 days after this report came out on June 20th, so we're about halfway there. Secondly, I would say that, again, it's how you characterize things. The notion that we were building the reserves while we were raising tuition, in one hand, is a statement that is not untruthful, but it is misleading. The majority of the tuition increase occurred during the worldwide recession in 2007 and 8 here in the University of California. And even with that massive increases that happened mid-year, the university lost, at that time in very rough numbers, had about a $3 billion or so appropriation from the state. In the course of just a handful of months, we lost $1 billion, a third of the state appropriation. And we'll get precise numbers in a report to everybody. And so the board, and this before my time, I was in the University of California at the time, and the regents then, everybody did massive percentage increases to help mitigate that loss of state funds. We also had to loan the state resources to maintain their cash balance. Now we got that money back with interest, so it was a good business move in retrospect, but we needed to come up with, what was it, Brad, something like $600 or $700 million almost overnight to give it to the state. Now, in the last 8 years, we have raised tuition one time by $270, $76. And that entire raise was because we did not get the appropriation, Jane, that we thought we needed. And all of those resources went to the graduation initiative, $75 million. And look at the results that it has provided. So yes, it's accurate that tuition went up over 10 years, but the majority of it was driven by the worldwide recession, and only once in 8 years has tuition been increased. We are required by law every year to have that tuition conversation with our students. And so we do have that conversation. So in case the economy changes during the year, or the board thinks at the end that we need to raise tuition, that is an option in front of the board. The $250,000 number, we don't actually agree with. We think the reserve really was about has grown about $662 million over the 10 years, which is growing at about $66 million a year, which is less than 1% of our revenues. So relative to our revenues is a fairly modest rate of growth. And it has come from remarkable investment returns that our investment committee has directed. It has come from planned contributions that each of the presidents make for the capital outlay, since the state law changed and requires us now to finance our capital renovations and new buildings. So for example, if we're going to build a $100 million science building, we can't even do that anymore, but let's just make that for the case of discussion. We have a practice that the campus has to come up with $10 million in cash, and then we finance the rest over a 20 or 30 year period. So again, at the direction of change in state law And at the direction of the Board of Trustees, we have instructed our campuses to grow their reserves that's dedicated to capital projects. And so you'll see on each campus that number growing in order to then, once you've accumulated enough, to make that 10% down payment so the building project can get done. And finally, whenever there's an operating fund savings on a campus, where you're right, if if you had budgeted this amount of money and you lost personnel during the year, then we put that in the reserve. It's a savings account, if you will. But the use of this reserve is for three major buckets. One is to front ongoing costs. And one of the ones that's really important is to make sure our students get their financial aid on time before the state refunds us for the Cal Grant programs and before the feds refund us for the Pell Grants. How horrifying it would be if a student who needs their financial aid check to come on time, we say, well, the feds have decided not to pay it. They're delayed by a month or two, and so you can't get your money when you need it. So that's in the student's best interest. The capital projects are in our students' best interest and our staff's best interest to have the seismic repairs and the safety issues taken care of to the degree we can. And finally, this piece that we put apart is sort of really the true rainy day piece. If you just looked at that element of it, it would actually support the operations of this university for a stunning 3 weeks. I mean, that gives me chills. And I think we realize that we can use those dollars in a recession to help mitigate the need to raise tuition. But if there's a huge recession, it won't be enough. If there's a minor recession and it's short term, then we'll use the reserves to sort of work our way through that. We'll delay construction projects. We will use that rainy day piece, and we won't have to raise tuition as much or at all. But if it's a big recession or a long-term recession or a change in policy in the state of California to defund the university, then we will have to look to either decrease services, decrease the number of employees, or raise revenues another way. So there's a hydraulic here. We will put together a summary of all of this activity. The final thing I would say is the reason that tuition money gets in there, and Brad is the expert here, but let me try it at a non-granular level, is we are required to spend only 1/12, right, of our state appropriation in any given month. And so we spend that. And then we use tuition dollars for the cost above what the state appropriation is. And so by the end of the 12-month period of time, we have spent down 100% of the state appropriation. And what's left is the interest earnings and tuition dollars that we then put in these designated reserves. So again, it's accurate to say there's tuition money in there, but it's misleading because the way in which we have to actually do our financing forces the only money left over at the end of the year to be tuition money and not state appropriation. So we will put this together in a sort of a 101 level, and then we'll put it together in a very fine level for anybody and everybody who wants to spend as much time as Brad spends and his team on understanding a very complex public funding finance model that has many, many state, federal, and CSU rules. But I will commit that we do not hide money. And I will commit that the reserves are important in the best interest of our students and our faculty in the state of California. And if you ever find a time where we have not fulfilled that commitment, then it is time.
Thank you, Chancellor White. I think that concludes the comments. I think we have all expressed our viewpoints on this issue, and it's time to move forward on a positive basis and attack these recommendations, particularly the reserve policy and particularly the parking revenue issue, so that we get a better handle on it and we have a clear reserve that everybody understands, and it's on our website and people can see it every day. Thank you, Chairman Day. That concludes the Audit Committee.
Thank you, Chair McGrory. We are now adjourned until 8:30 a.m. tomorrow morning.